السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين، والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين سيدنا ونبينا ومولانا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. Welcome back to the lessons of Nuzha an-Naḍar. And firstly, I need to apologize for sending messages via Brother Adib about the fees, because we explained about the fees in December. I also explained the reason for the fees, and then also in the last lesson there were those who didn't pay, and therefore I had to send. And even worse than that, it was we have in the other lessons, with regards to the other kitab, a qualified alim who actually lied on the WhatsApp group and says that he paid fees, and therefore I had to send those messages. Because to make it clear again that I'm totally fine if you don't pay, but the whole condition is please just inform me. That's all. So that's the only condition. Nevertheless, to continue, Ibn Hajar rahmallah says, ثم المروي تارة يخترعه الواضع وتارة يأخذ كلام غيره كبعض السلف الصالح أو قدماء الحكماء أو الإسرائيليات أو يأخذ حديثا ضعيف الإسناد فيركب له إسنادا صحيحا ليروج. So here Nuruddin Itr rahmallah, he put the i'rab as liyaruja, but Alama Mullah al-Qari rahmallah, he said bitashdid al-waw, so that it will be liyuraw, and then he says you can read it with a fatha or with a kasra, so liyuraw wija or liyuraw waja. So here basically he's explaining the origin and the basis of fabricated narrations. And he mentions both of the possible and actually the logical ways that either a person would concoct the narration himself, or the person takes the statement of another person and then he attributes that to the Prophet ﷺ. So whether it is a statement of a pious person or someone who was wise, or a narration of the Ahlul Kitab, the Israeliyat, they falsely attribute all of these to the Prophet ﷺ. So here you should remember that everything that the Prophet ﷺ said is beautiful, but that does not mean that every beautiful statement is the words of the Prophet ﷺ, because it makes sense. There's so much wisdom in it that we can attribute it to the Prophet ﷺ. So that is incorrect. Then the third method which he mentions is that they would take a reliable chain and they would attach it to a statement or to a text which has not been authentically related. So he says ثم المروي تارة يخترعه الواضع, that he fabricates it, the person fabricates it on his own, he himself comes up with it, and he could do this here for various different reasons and different motives, as it will be explained in the next paragraph. So this here is, the commentators mentioned that it's what would happen most of the time in the past. So you will find that in Yawaqit wa Durar, he says, Aktharul Mawdu'at. Likewise, Mullah al-Qari rahmallah also mentions that this is what would happen more commonly. The next type, he says, وَتَارَةً يَأْخُذُ كَلَامَ غَيْرِهِ كَبَعْضِ السَّلَفِ الصَّالِحِ. That at times, he takes the statements of other people and attribute that to the Prophet ﷺ. So this is probably what happens the most in our era. That you find if you when people send you questions about various ahadith, most of the time when you have to research it, you will be able to find that it's actually the statement of someone else. So that is why I say that probably in our time, in today's times, it's this year is more common, where they will take the statements of someone else and attribute it to the Prophet ﷺ. So Alama Uqayli rahmallah, he quotes what his sanad in al-Du'afa from Muhammad bin Sa'id al-Maslub is that he said, لا بأس إذا كان كلام حسن أن تضع له إسنادا. So you can see that they would actually regard it as permissible. That he's saying that there's absolutely no problem if you have some beautiful words, some wise statements, that you can just fabricate a sanad for it. So this here is where a person takes it. So he's saying that Kabad is Salaf is Salih, maybe is taking the statement of a pious person, or Qudama il-Hukama, or maybe a person who was the sage of his age, or Israeliyat, or maybe he takes the statements of the Ahlul Kitab and he attributes it to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So Mullah al-Qari says, وَمِنْهَا مَوْقُفَاتُ الْحَسَنِ حَيْثُ قِيلَ فِي حَقِّهِ كلامه يشبه كلام الأنبياء. That Hassan Basri rahmallah, many of his statements, it would be said with regards to him that his words resembles the words of the Anbiya. And this here is actually a topic which you can give an entire lecture of, because muhaddithun, the experience with the words of Nabi sallallahu alayhi wasallam, so they would adopt the style also, and they would manage to get this method of talking as well. So Hassan Basri rahmallah, many times his statements would be falsely attributed to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. In his commentary of Alfiya, Alama Iraqi rahmallah gave the example of the statement حب الدنيا رأس كل خطيئة, that the love of this world is the basis for all sins. So he says that this here is either the statement of Malik bin Dinar, because this is how Ibn Abi Dunya narrated it in Maqayid al-Shaytan, it's a book of his, or it is the statement of Hazrat Isa alayhi salam, because this is how Imam Bayhaqi rahmallah narrated it in his Kitab az-Zuhd. And it's only proven from Nabi sallallahu alayhi wasallam mursalan, from Hassan Basri rahimahullah. But then he says وَمَرَاسِيلُ الْحَسَنْ عِنْدَهُمْ شِبْهُ الرِّيحِ, that the marasil of Hassan Basri rahmallah has no weight at all, and therefore these words cannot be attributed to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So when you go to Maqasidul Hasanam, you will find that how the statement was also attributed to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. He references it to Musnadul Firdaus of Alama Daylami, and he says that his son also attributed it bila isnad. Likewise, he proves that even others, it has been attributed to others besides Malik bin Dinar and Isa alayhi salam. So he says وعند ابن يونس في ترجمة سعد بن مسعود من تاريخ مصر له من قول سعد. So you can see there it's mentioned as a statement of Sa'ad. وجزم ابن تيمية بأنه من قول جندب البجلي رضي الله عنه. So like this here, it's not the statement of Nabi sallallahu alayhi wasallam, rather it is the statement of someone else, and it is being attributed to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So this is what a person would do. He would find some words like this here, and he would just attribute it to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And like we say, they would regard it as permissible. Alama Fatni rahmallah in Tazkiratul Mawdu'at, he says وَمِنْهُمْ مَنْ أَجَازَ وَضَعَ الْأَسَانِيدِ لِكَلَامٍ حَسَنٍ, that there were those who would regard this here as permissible. So that's an example of some pious person, Hassan rahmallah. Then Alama Iraqi rahmallah, and likewise here Alama Munawi rahmallah in al-Yawaqit wa Durar, they give the example of al-Ma'da Bayt al-Dah, that the stomach is the house of sicknesses, wal-Himya Ra's al-Dawah. So he says that لا أصل له من كلام المصطفى بل هو من كلام الحارث بن كلة طبيب العرب. So you can see that this here is not the words of Nabi sallallahu alayhi wasallam. Actually, there were those who, because I said that this here is what happens most of the times in our era. So you will find many times it happens like this here, where people will take the statements of Sahaba and they would attribute it to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So Imam Hakim rahmallah mentions this here in Al-Madkhal ila Kitab al-Iklil. He says, الطبقة الرابعة من المجروحين قوم عملوا إلى أحاديث صحيحة عن الصحابة. So it's narrated authentically from the Sahaba. رفعوها إلى رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم, and then they would attribute it to the Prophet صلى الله عليه وسلم. And he gives examples, and these examples here will also be apt to prove what comes in the next paragraph, where you will see that people fabricate this and attributed it to the Prophet صلى الله عليه وسلم because it supports their verdict and it supports their view. Then he says, Awil Israeliyat. So like we said, that this here is the narrations of Ahlul Kitab. Or maybe it's even the statement of scholars of the Ahlul Kitab, or a verse of the Torah, of the Injil. He takes those kind of statements and attributes it to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And then the other method is أو يأخذ حديثا ضعيف الإسناد. It takes a narration which is related with a weak sanad, فيركب له إسنادا صحيحا, and he makes up a sahih narration. Like we said, that this here could be read as ليروج ليروج ليروج, so that it can circulate it can be circulated. So this is what he does. He basically, he just wants to give prominence to that weak narration. If it's narrated as a weak narration, then scholars might not accept it. So as you can see, that this here has some basis because it's weak, and a weak narration to a certain extent is acceptable. So this here is not as bad as fabricating your own words or taking the words off, although it is something which is detested, but it's not as bad as that. And Alama Munawi rahmallah says that in al-Hafiz ibn Dihya kana yaf'alu dhalika, that you'll see Hafiz ibn Dihya, he would do the siyah, that he would take a weak narration, he would fabricate a authentic sanad for it, and then he would narrate it. So now the question is that what would prompt a person to fabricate? That why would he falsely attribute something to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam? So here in this next paragraph, Alama ibn Hajar rahmallah explains the motives by saying, وَالْحَامِلُ لِلْوَاضِعِ عَلَى الْوَضْعِ إِمَّا عَدَمُ الدِّينِ كَالزَّنَادِقَةِ أو غلبة الجهل كبعض المتعبدين أو فرط العصبية كبعض المقلدين أو اتباع هوى بعض الرؤساء أو الإغراب لقصد الاشتهار. He mentions various reasons why a person would fabricate. So he says the first thing which would motivate a person to fabricate is Adamuddin. That this person here, he was not a Muslim to begin with. So he gives the example and he says, Kazanadika, the heretics. So these are hypocrites or atheists. وهم المبطنون للكفر المظهرون للإسلام. So that is hypocrites that in reality they are concealing the kufr and they are making it appear as if they are Muslims. أو الذين لا يتدينون بدين, or they don't have any deen. So basically those who opposed Islam, the enemy of the Muslims, those who had a vendetta against Muslims, they would do the siyam. They would fabricate narrations. And their motive and objective is very clear, that they wanted to lead people astray, or maybe at the very least they wanted to cause some confusion. So they wanted to harm this deen, and therefore they would fabricate. Allama ibn al-Jawzi rahmallah mentions with regards to them in his mawdu'at that az-zanadiqa alladhina qasadu ifsad al-shari'a wa iqa' al-shak fi qulub al-awami wa tala'ub bid-din. So this is what they would do. And there was a numerous amount of narrations which they would do. Also he mentions of how some would fabricate, that he says, وَرَبِيبُ حَمَّادِ ibn Salama وَكَانَ يَدُسُّ الْأَحَادِيث فِي كُتُبِ حَمَّادِ, that he would take the notes of Hamad and he would actually fill it with fabricated narrations. And he mentions about Abdul Karim bin Abil Arja, is very famous, that at the time when he was caught fabricating, and now it was the decision and the ruling was passed that he is to be executed. So once he knew now that there is no way out, he's definitely going to be killed, he said, والله لقد وضعت فيكم 4000 حديثا أحرم فيها الحلال وأحل فيها الحرام. He took an oath and he said that I have fabricated 4000 narrations, and such narrations where I have made the impermissible permissible and I have made the permissible impermissible. And he says, وَلَقَدْ فَطَّرْتُكُمْ فِي يَوْمِ صَوْمِكُمْ وَصَوَّمْتُكُمْ فِي يَوْمِ فِطْرِكُمْ. Another thing which I caused is that the moon would not be sighted, but I would go and give testimony, because obviously he's a hypocrite, so people assumed him to be a Muslim. So he said that I would go and give testimony that the moon is sighted, and therefore people would celebrate the day of Eid. Meantime, the moon was not sighted. وَصَوَّمْتُكُمْ فِي يَوْمِ فِطْرِكُمْ. But you can see that he's saying 4000 narrations. You can see what a huge amount they fabricated. So likewise, Mullah al-Qari rahmallah in his commentary, he narrates from Alama Uqayli, and he attributes it to Alama Uqayli. He said, فَقَدْ قَالَ حَمَّادُ بْنُ زَيْدٍ فِيمَا أَخْرَجَهُ الْعُقَيْلِ إِنَّهُمْ وَضَعُوا 14,000 حَدِيثٍ. So he's saying that they fabricated 14,000 narrations. But here the question is that where does it come with a sanad? So Mullah al-Qari is attributing it to Alama Uqayli, and many scholars before, for example, Ibn Hajar rahmallah, Alama Sakhawi rahmallah, Alama Suyuti rahmallah, they all also attributed this here to Alama Uqayli. But in both fronts of his du'afa, you will see that it comes with the amount of 12,000, not 14,000. So if you're attributing it to Alama Uqayli, unless maybe obviously maybe if they had a different manuscript and in there it was mentioned 14,000. Ibn al-Jawzi rahmallah is actually the one who quoted it with a sanad and mentioned 14,000. So he narrated with his sanad to Hakam ibn al-Mubarak that he says, سمعت حماد بن زيد يقول وضعت الزنادقة على رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم 14,000 حديث. That they fabricated 14,000 narrations. But although he assumed that he tricked the Muslims, he's saying that he's saying that I made halal haram. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala divinely taken the responsibility of protecting this deen. So they were unable to cause any harm. Rather, when they died, the fabrications died with them. That today, if you try to even look for one narration which is narrated via Abdul Karim, you will not be able to find it. So Mullah al-Qari says that فَبَيَّنَ نُقَادُ الْحَدِيث أَمْرَهَا فِي ذَلِكَ كُلِّهِ ولم يخفى عنهم من شأنها ما خفي على غيرهم بحيث لما قيل لابن المبارك هذه الأحاديث الموضوعة قال يعيش لها الجهابذة أي نقاد الحديث. And thereafter he gave as a proof for it the verse of the Quran إنا نحن نزلنا ذكر وإنا لهم لحافظون. So Mullah al-Qari says وكأنه أراد أنه من جملة حفظ لفظ الذكر حفظ معناه ومن جملة معانيه الأحاديث النبوية الدالة على توضيح مبانيه. So just like how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has divinely taken the responsibility of protecting the Quran, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has also taken the responsibility of protecting that which explains the Quran. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentioned that Nabi sallallahu alayhi wa sallam لِتُبَيِّنَ لِلنَّاسِ مَا نُزِّلَ إِلَيْهِمْ. So the words of Nabi sallallahu alayhi wa sallam are also preserved and protected. And besides that, it was actually easy for an average scholar to detect the fabrications of those who were enemies of Islam. Why? Because their fabrications would generally be in direct contrast to a clear verse of the Quran. So they would be able to see that this person is narrating like this, but it clearly contradicts this verse, or it opposes an important tenet of Sharia. So if you have to open the relevant chapter in Al-Mawdu'at of Ibn al-Jawzi, you will see how easy it is to realize that these definitely cannot be words of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. For example, if you look that sometimes they would come up with really silly statements and attribute it. Like one example is where so it's quoted with the sanad that Inna Allah azza wa jalla idha ghadiba anzala al-wahya bil-arabiyyah wa idha radiya anzala al-wahya bil-farsiyah. So obviously this here is a fabrication that when Allah is happy, he is angry, then he sends down wahi in Arabic, and when he's happy, he sends down wahi in Farsi. So this here, a person doesn't have to even be a scholar. A person can be just a student. He doesn't even have to be a student. Like you look at another example that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created himself from the perspiration of a horse. So this here, a person doesn't even have to be a student of an average Muslim will be able to detect that this here is a blatant lie. So therefore, when the Zanadiqa would fabricate a hadith, it would be very, very easy to realize that this here is a fabrication, and scholars of hadith would dismiss it. Then, our ghalabatul jahl, that a person is extremely ignorant. A person is extremely ignorant. He doesn't know. But now look at what example he gives here. He says, كَبَعْضِ الْمُتَعَبِّدِينَ, that there were many pious people who perpetrate this here. So Mullah al-Qari explains al-muntasibina ila al-ibadati was-zahada, that they are those who people knew that this person here, he's spending the entire night in prayer, or he's a great zahid. So they would fabricate narrations. Then Mullah al-Qari says وَهُمْ أَعْظَمُ الْأَصْنَافِ ضَرَرًا عَلَىٰ أَنفُسِهِمْ وَغَيْرِهِمْ, that these people cause the greatest harm. Why they cause the greatest harm? Because people would look at their piety and they would trust them. And then they would think that this person here cannot be lying, cannot be falsely attributing something to the Prophet ﷺ. So they would take that to be deen. And they would then attribute it with absolute confidence to the Prophet ﷺ. لِمَا نُسِبُوا إِلَيْهِ مِنَ الزُّهْدِ وَالصَّلَاحِ وَيَقْتَدُونَ بِأَفْعَالِهِمْ, saying that people would follow them, and therefore they cause the greatest harm. Because now to detect this, imagine you come in Tatbīq Rawi al-Masyuti gives examples, and we'll discuss it also in the next paragraph when discussing the ruling. So these are people who would be fasting the entire day. They would be, people know them to be extremely pious people. So to say, even if you have to mention it, that this person is quoting a fabrication, people would attack you that how could you say such a pious person is falsely attributing something. But there's a difference between piety and between having knowledge in the field of hadith. So again, yeah, it's actually something which is umum wa khusus, that every master of hadith was pious. Every master of hadith was pious. And that is why, like whenever you talk, you can talk about how they knew hundreds of thousands of ahadith and how they would memorize on the spur of the moment. But you will have to be able, you also find in the books, it comes that of how they would, the piety and the taqwa, etc. is all mentioned. So every scholar of hadith was pious, but every pious person is not a scholar of hadith. And therefore you will find that even sometimes mufassirun, sometimes fuqaha, you will find in their books there are numerous fabrications. أوفرت العصبية كبعض المقلدين. So he says أوفرت العصبية, when a person is a fanatic. So whether he is a fanatic about his country, so he loves his country, so you will find that there are fabrications, especially in those times, fabrications on the fadail of a certain region. Or maybe a person was from a particular tribe, or even maybe he loved a particular sahabi, so he would fabricate. And this here comes a lot in the issue of Ahlul Bayt, where they would fabricate a hadith in support of Hazrat Ali radiallahu anhu, and taking it another step, they would fabricate against Muawiyah radiallahu anhu. So these are all from Asabiyah. And Ibn Hajar rahmallah, he gives the example of Asabiyah كبعض المقلدين, that this here now refers to the deviant sects of the past, that you will find many of them, they would fabricate. And it also refers to those who follow a particular madhab. So those who held different beliefs and ideologies, they would commonly fabricate. And examples which are given in the books of Mustalah, generally like the Khattabiyah, the Salimiyah, all these kind of sects, they had like some weird beliefs, like they believed in hulul, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala can come in a form of a person, etc. But the Khawarij and the Rafidis, they are also known for this year. So Allama Khalili rahmallah, in his Kitab al-Irshad, he says that وضعت الرافضة في فضائل علي رضي الله عنه وآل البيت نحو من 300,000 hadith, that they fabricated over 300,000 ahadith. You can see what a huge number compared to the Zanadiqa. The Zanadiqa, it's 12,000 to 14,000. Here it's already going in the hundreds of thousands, 300,000 narrations. Why? Because at the spur of the moment, they would just invent a narration. Like Ibn al-Jawzi rahmallah, he narrates what his sanad, it goes to Ibn al-Lahi'a, that he said that سمعت شيخا من الخوارج تاب ورجع وهو يقول, that I heard a person from the Khawarij, now when he wanted to rectify his life, so he's making tawbah, so he said إن هذه الأحاديث دين فانظروا عمن تأخذون دينكم فإنا كنا إذا هوينا أمرا صيرناه حديثا. When we like something, we would make up a hadith for it. So this here is how they would fabricate so many narrations. And then further he narrates from Imam Hakim rahimahullah, that he says with regards to a person, Muhammad bin Qasim al-Talikani, so he says وَكَانَ مِنْ رُؤَسَاءِ الْمُرْجِئَةِ. So all these sects here, Murji'ah and all of that, it's actually in Aqidah, you discuss it in detail. And it's very interesting to discuss it, because when you discuss all of these previous sects, you find how, although those sects have died off, but the beliefs are still common in today's times. So he says that وَكَانَ مِنْ رُؤَسَاءِ الْمُرْجِئَةِ مِمَّنْ يَضَعُ الْحَدِيث عَلَى مَذْهَبِهِمْ, that they would fabricate a hadith to support their ideologies. So this was the reason why they would fabricate. Al-Imam Munawi says فَيَضَعُ ذَلِكَ تَقْرِيرًا لِمَذْهَبِهِ وَرَدًّا لِلْخَصْمِ, to strengthen their own beliefs and to make the beliefs of others seem to be invalid. And he gives many examples of this. Like سَيَجِيُ أَقْوَامٌ مِّنْ أُمَّتِي يَقُولُونَ الْقُرْآنُ مَخْلُوقٌ فَمَنْ قَالَ ذَلِكَ فَقَدْ كَفَرَ. Like that, he gives a example and many other examples. So those were the deviant sects of the past. They fabricated to prove their beliefs. But then you also have those from different madahib who fabricated. So earlier we mentioned, when we are quoting from Al-Madkhal ila Kitab al-Iklil, Then I told you about the Sahaba radiyallahu anhum. So they fabricated just to support their view, that they wanted to support their view, and for that they said ash-shufuq al-humra, that the shufuq at the time of the end time of Maghrib and the beginning time of Isha. So they just said attributed it to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Likewise, man kana lahu imamun fa qira'at al-imam lahu. So this is how it says attributed to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. In this way, they would just fabricate things to make it seem like whatever they are saying is proven from the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And besides that, you also have where it's also in Al-Madkhal ila Kitab al-Iqlil, likewise in Al-Mawdu'at, where they fabricated again in support of their Imam and against other Imams. So, for example, he quotes, سيكون في أمتي رجل يقال له أبو حنيفة هو سراج أمتي. So, Imam Abu Hanifa definitely is so great, but this here is a fabrication. And then he says that the same person, when he came, Abu Abdullah al-Bawraqi, when he came to Iraq, then he said, وَسَيَكُونُ فِي أُمَّتِي رَجُلٌ يُقَالُ لَهُ مُحَمَّدُ بْنُ إِدْرِيسِ فِتْنَتُهُ عَلَى أُمَّتِ أَضَرُّ مِنْ إِبْلِيسِ. So that's how it's quoted in Al-Mawdu'at of Ibn al-Jawzi. So you can see these are clear fabrications. أو اتباع هوى بعض الرؤساء. Some would fabricate just to get proximity to leaders or maybe to high profile political personalities. So you can remember in the previous lesson, in the previous page, if you got the same print like me, it's وكما وقع لغياث بن إبراهيم حيث دخل على المهد فوجده يلعب بالحمام فساق في الحادي إسنادا إلى النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم. So Ghiyath bin Ibrahim, he fabricated about the competition of pigeons just so that he could impress Mahdi, who was the ruler of the time. Now this example is given, although scholars mention this as a point that people would fabricate to impress the leaders. Sheikh Mustafa Azmi, he mentions that in different books when you go, you find that they all give the same example. That different books of Mustalah, they're all giving the same example. So that makes it seem like this was not a very common reason for fabricating. Like no one gives a different example. Although Alama Munawi rahmallah, he says in Yawaqit wa Durar, وَالْأَحَادِيثُ الَّتِي وُضِعَتْ فِي الدَّوْلَةِ الْعَبَاسِيَّةِ نصوصا على إمامة العباس وأولاده إلى قيام الساعة. It means you get there are ahadith which were supporting the Abbasi dynasty. So probably like that, but this year was not such a common reason like the others. أو الإغراب لقصد الاشتهار. They fabricate in order to become famous. So sometimes they would fabricate an entire narration, and at other times they would simply just change the name of one narrator in the chain, like how it comes. We done it in Muqaddimah ibn Salah. Like the narration comes, so it's authentic narration. They even substituting a thiqa rawi. It's Nafi' an ibn Umar. They change it to Salim an ibn Umar. But the reason why they're doing this here is just so that they can become unique, so that people, because obviously the scholars of that time were looking for these kind of narrations. So if he has to narrate it in a different way, then people will travel to him, his circle will become larger, people would flock to him. And this here also then leads back to the chapter of Gharib narrations. You remember we were discussing it, why so many scholars were uncomfortable with narrations which were transmitted only via a singular person. So Imam Munawi rahmallah mentions a few people would commonly do this. They would just narrate so that they can become famous and popular. He says, كما وقع لابن أبي دحية وبهلول بن عبيد وأسرم بن حوشب. He actually gets this here from Imam Hakim rahmallah. Imam Hakim rahmallah says, منهم إبراهيم بن يسوع وهو ابن أبي دحية يحدث عن جعفر بن محمد الصادق وهشام بن عروة فيركب حديث هذا على حديث ذلك وكذلك حماد بن عمرو وبهلول بن عبيد وأسرم بن حوشب. So these are people who were famous in that time, that they would just fabricate a hadith so that they can become popular and people can flock to them. They just wanted to be unique and they wanted to stand out. So here Mullah al-Qari rahmallah, he quotes an interesting incident with which we can conclude. He says that one day Imam Ahmad rahmallah and Yahya bin Ma'in, they performed a salah together in a particular masjid. And after salah, فَقَامَ بَيْنَ أَيْدِيهِمَا قَاسٍ. after Salah, a person stood up to deliver a lecture. And when he stood up to deliver the lecture, he said, حدثنا أحمد بن حنبل ويحيى بن معين. And he gave the full sanad. He says, قال حدثنا عبد الرزاق قال حدثنا معمر عن قتادة عن أنس رضي الله عنه. And he quoted the sanad from Nabi sallallahu alayhi wasallam. من قال لا إله إلا الله يخلق الله من كل كلمة منها طائر منقاره من ذهب وريشه من مرجان. And he began to quote like this here, 20 pages. So many virtues of a person who says La ilaha illallah. And while he's busy quoting this lengthy narration, فَجَعَلَ أَحْمَدْ يَنْظُرُ إِلَى يَحْيَى وَيَحْيَى يَنْظُرُ إِلى أَحْمَدْ. Imam Ahmad is looking at Yahya, Yahya bin Ma'in is looking at Imam Ahmad, and they're signaling to one another, أَنْتَ حَدَّثْتَهُ بِهَذَا? Did you narrate it to him? Imam Ahmad is saying, وَاللَّهِ مَا سَمِعْتُ بِهِ إِلَّا هَذِهِ السَّاعَةِ. That's the first time I am hearing it. So they said quietly, فَسَكَتَ جَمِيعًا حَتَّى فَرَغَ. When he completed, they called him and they said, so when they called him, he thought he didn't recognize who they were. So فَجَاءَهُ مُتَوَهِمًا لِنَوَالِ الْخَيْرِ. He thought that he will get some money from them or he will get some payment from them. So Yahya told him, مَنْ حَدَّثَكَ بِهَذَا? So on the spur of the moment, he said that Ahmad ibn Hanbal wa Yahya ibn Ma'in, Ahmad bin Hanbal and Yahya bin Ma'in told me. So Imam Yahya bin Ma'in said that أَنَا ibn Ma'in, هذا أحمد بن حنبل. So ما سمعنا بهذا قط في حديث رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم. Then he told him that if you really have to fabricate, then فعلى غيرنا, please don't use our names. So that person, he was quick. He said, أنت ابن معين? Are you sure you are Ibn Ma'in? So he said, yes. So then that person said, لم أزل أسمع أن ابن معين أحمق. I always heard that Ibn Ma'in is foolish. وما علمت إلى هذه الساعة. And you are proving it now. So Yahya bin Ma'in said that كيف علمت أني أحمق? What made you say that I am foolish? He said كأنه ليس في الدنيا يحيى بن معين وأحمد بن حنبل غيركما. The way you are acting is that you are the only Yahya bin Ma'in and Ahmad bin Hanbal in this world. He says that I know of 17 Ahmad bin Hanbals besides us. So then they just stood up and they told him that دعوا يقوم, just leave him alone. فقام كالمستهزئ بهما. So you can see this is how he just fabricated. So this here is one a way that they would fabricate on the spur of the moment. And this is also what became very famous in our times, where to attract large audiences and to gain popularity, a person would just fabricate. So Alama Munawi, before quoting the same incident, he said, وَأَعْظَمُ الْبَلَى مِنَ الْقُصَّاصِ, that the greatest harm and calamity of those who deliver lectures is يَفْعَلُونَ ذَلِكَ تَرْقِيقًا لِقُلُوبِ الْعَوَامِ, that you just want to make the hearts of those who are listening, trying to make it tarqiq. So therefore they fabricate like this here, وَتَرْقِيبًا فِي الْأَذْكَارِ وَالْأَوْرَادِ. So Sheikh Ibrahim al-Lahimi says, وَهُمْ مِنْ أَكْثَرِ الْأَصْنَافِ الْمَذْكُورَ وَضْعًا لِلْأَحَادِيثِ. These are the ones who fabricated the most. And sadly this year continued right up until today. Like we said, that even some of the most prolific lecturers, they have to embellish their lectures with these kind of fabrications. So if you look at Maulana Tariq Jamil, when he came here to South Africa, if you can go on the internet, you'll find the recording. He gave a long lecture in Cape Town, but the entire lecture was based around a fabrication. So this is, and that is why Sheikh Yunus Saharanpuri, rahimahullah, we quoted it before also, he said that a person cannot be a lecturer and a muhaddith at the same time. Because if you want to give flowery lectures, then obviously if you're going to, for example, the example which he gave, if you have to talk on niyat and you have to go quote innamal a'malu bin niyat, people heard that. So they won't be so mesmerized with your speech. But if you have to come with some nice juicy story, then they would be able to, they will praise you after your lecture, and in that way you will get a prominence. So these are the few who Ibn Hajar rahmallah mentioned. But then Ibn al-Hanbali rahmallah says, "Oh, yakun al-wad'u wahman wa ghalatan." That there are even those who by mistake or by error they would fabricate. So Sheikh Rahili rahmallah hafidhahullah, he explains this here and he said, "Lakin hunaka asbabun awqa'at ashabuha fil kadhb min ghairi ta'ammudin lahu." And then he says that the first type is those who would do it because of being so pious. Maybe at times a person would fabricate when he lost his books. So now he lost his books, but he would attempt to still hold a majlis and he would try to narrate, and in that way he would fabricate. And then at another time is when a person would lose his memory. So these are various reasons which a person would fabricate. Inshallah, we'll continue on Saturday. Until then, Jazakumullah khairan. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.